Genesis chapter 2 verse 4. Genesis chapter 2 verse 4. It says, these are the what? The generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. And they will say, you see, it says generations. So these were not 6 literal days, it represented generations, even thousands of years. And so they argue that a day in Genesis does not represent a literal day, it represents a longer period of time. And that is why the earth will behold according to the tools of science, because the days in Genesis are not literal days, they represent thousands, even millions of years, generations. Now here is my question. Are the days in Genesis literal days? 24-hour periods. Huh? How do you know? Thank you. One reason, first of all the days in Genesis are literal 24-hour days. They are not figurative, symbolic, representing longer periods of time. And reason number one, as my brother says, that each day of creation was marked by an evening and a morning. It says there, it was evening and morning the first day, evening and morning the second day. In other words, it will not make sense to say it was evening and morning of 1,000 years. Are you getting what I'm saying? You can only have an evening and a morning of a literal day. Are you with me? Reason number two, why the days are literal, is that each day in Genesis has a numeral qualifier. And somebody will ask, and what is that? Each day in Genesis, it does not just say, God did this evening and morning, it was a day. But it says the first day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day. Each day has a numeral qualifier, and in Scripture, consistently, every time we have a day with a numeral qualifier, it is a literal day. And so it leads us to the conclusion that the days in Genesis must likewise be literal days. For example, when Jesus says that I must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things in the hands of the elders, be killed, and rise again the third day, he meant after 3,000 years, isn't it? Of course not. What did he mean? When he says the third day, the fact that it has a numeral qualifier, they understood literally after 3 days. Are you getting what I'm saying? And so likewise, when we read about the first day, second day, third day in Genesis, we must come to the same conclusion that these are literal days. Reason number 3. Do you notice that there is an emphasis in Genesis that what you are reading is not prophecy, is not figurative? Every time you will come across the expression after God created and did something, it will say, and it was so. As though God understood, there will be an attempt for us to reinterpret what we are reading. Are you getting what I'm saying? And so the expression, it was so, it means that when we talk about it was evening and morning, then it was so, it was not figurative, representing indefinite periods of time. Lastly, for the interest of time, how will you tell that the days in Genesis are literal? It's the 4th commandment. We have just read Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. And there, we are given the reason for keeping the Sabbath. Now, why do we keep the Sabbath? Why do we keep the Sabbath? Yes? It begins by saying, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Verse 8, isn't it? And all those things. And then why should we keep the Sabbath? Verse 11 says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, and all that is in them is. So let me ask you, why do we work for 6 days and rest the 7th? It is because, according to that passage, God also worked for 6 days and rested what? The 7th. Do you notice that if each day represents 1,000 years, it means that we must also work for 6,000 years, then we can keep the Sabbath. Now, how old are you? And how far are you from keeping the first Sabbath of your life? Do you notice that the 4th commandment is only practical if God also worked for 6 days and rested the 7th? That is only when we can also work 6 days and rest the 7th. But if it took longer period, 6,000 years for example, then it is impossible for us to keep this commandment because we must also work for the same period of time. Are you getting what I'm saying? And so the 4th commandment becomes only practical and makes sense if God also worked for 6 days and rested the 7th. And by the way, as a footnote there, other Christians will say, but you see, even if it is so, this Sabbath in Genesis was not meant for all Christians. Because if it was so, God would have commanded Adam and Eve, tomorrow is Sabbath, keep the Sabbath holy. But if you read the creation account, there is nowhere God tells Adam and Eve, remember the Sabbath. Now question, why don't you find a verse in Genesis where God tells them to keep the Sabbath? Are you getting my question? Because if it is marriage, people will argue that marriage is meant for everyone. Because God told Adam, a man shall leave his father and mother. And do you notice God told him, a man shall leave his father and mother, and God knew Adam and Eve had no father and mother. And so it means that marriage was meant for all mankind. But in Genesis, you do not find God telling Adam, tomorrow is Sabbath, keep it holy. So how do you resolve that one? So the Sabbath came after sin. The